Hello, everyone. We're back again on our channel, Wagner on Ethics and Leadership. Today, Dr. Wagner is going to talk about yet another book of his, The Whispering God, the one that he's holding in his hands right now. Dr. Paul Wagner has taught philosophy of religion to both graduate and undergraduate students. The theme of philosophy is decidedly sectarian, and deals with issues of deism, and atheism. This book deals with prayer, the seasons of spiritual development, meditative prayer, and both the great promise and the great path, as in the context of Christian religiosity. Also, the co-author, Mrs. Jeanene Wagner, a former model and an actress. She has often been a Bible study leader. She will not be joining us for this session, but she will be definitely there for the next and the one after that. So, welcome again, Dr. Wagner. Thank you so much for the time and the new book, or the new book for us for the podcast, for discussing the topics in this book. I would like to start with my first question. Um, the title. Why did you guys decide on this title? Why did you title this book The Whispering God?
That's really an important question because it really drove the entire interest of writing a book. On the one hand, I could say, for my part, I was charmed by all the ritual that was involved in religious practices from the time I was 7 or 8 years old onward. I was even an altar boy in the Catholic Church from 11 years old to 14, as what they called a master altar boy. I was in charge of weddings and funerals and benedictions um, and of course mass and so on. And I pondered often the people throughout history who prayed quietly, who prayed without speaking. Um, Catholics will often say a rosary, and people will wonder two things about the rosary. They say, why are you praying to Mary? Well, Catholics have never prayed to Mary. If you listen to the prayer, the Hail Mary, you're asking Mary to pray for you, just like somebody in any religion might ask their pastor or a friend of theirs, please pray for me. I'm going to this operation now, or whatever it might be. So the Hail Mary was never praying to Mary. It was asking Mary to pray for you. In any case, it's a repetitive prayer. And just as you would find in many Eastern religions, um, it's the from Judaism where they daven, or in Hindu or in Buddhist religions where you engage in repetitive sorts of activities to bring your mind away from the distractions of the immediate world to rest more deeply on a world beyond. Sort of whispering God. Um, Let me take you up many, many years to a time not so terribly long ago in my own life. And I'll also tell you an episode which cinched the deal for me. Um, I had, uh, I was to give a speech at a conference. And it was actually the first really big conference that I was ever going to be speaking at. And it was on philosophy. And I took the airplane to the destination. I was going to go right from the airport to where the conference was. And then we'd be there for 3 days, but boom, I was going to be right on stage and, first getting going. I had a terrible sinus headache. And then going up in a jet, your sinus headache gets even worse. I land. I never take pills of any kind, but I went to a drugstore and I got whatever they had. I got Dristan, not to give a bad publication for Dristan, but if you know about Dristan, it fires you up more than just your sinuses. I never drank coffee. I drank my Dristan down, 2 Dristan, with a cup of black coffee so I could clear my head for my speech. I did just fine on the speech. As we were going through the questions and answers, I was still doing fine. But toward the end, I could feel my heart going brrr. When my speech was over with, there was a break. I went to the hotel, went up to my room, and I was pondering, what do I do now? I'm too young to be having a heart attack or whatever. My heart won't stop, racing. And I didn't know what to do. And this was at a city here down in the South. And I thought, well, it's in the South. I was from Chicago. I said, well, it's in the South. They might have a Gideon Bible somewhere. So I'm opening up drawers and I find this Gideon Bible. It's a green backed Bible. Mm-hmm. So I prayed to God and I said, God, I know this is just my mind. I don't want to, go to a hospital or call a doctor at this point. I'm too young. This is just my mind, but I need help. And okay, I had my eyes closed, and I flipped that Bible open. I put my finger down, and I opened my eyes. And the sentence that I read was, "My peace I give to you. My peace I leave with you." Now, that's pretty spectacular in and of itself. But there's more. Right after that, it was like a huge ocean wave gently came flowing over me. And I felt so happy. I was giddy. And I didn't quite know what to do. Should I go right back down and head over to the conference? Or should I just, I was almost tempted to want to just sit down and laugh, or lay down and just luxuriate in this most extraordinary experience. And I did sit down for a moment, and actually I laid back and I thought, this is amazing. How does this continue like this? This is like an experience I can't put into words. But after a few moments, I decided, well, I've got a responsibility to go back to the conference. And I said to God, thanks for help here. And but I know I've got to get on with the day. And so I did. And I got up, and the rest of the day, of course, was wonderful. Well, from that, I became very interested in lots of, shall we say, mystical experiences. There was a philosopher by the name of W.T. Stace, S-T-A-C-E, who wrote a book called The Teachings of the Mystics. But he's an analytic philosopher. That means, he's usually focused more on math and analysis of words than anything that would have anything to do with mysticism or spirituality. And as I'm reading through this, and he's talking about many of the Eastern religions, and Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and in every one of the religions, he points out that there are special moments that people are attracted to, and that really, in a sense, sustain those religions more than doctrinal teachings or a simple gesture like saying grace before a meal, which are all good things, but this was really special. And so I remember then starting to read about monks in different parts of the world. I remember one story that was particularly nice. There's a place in the peninsula of Greece called Mount Athos. And at one point, they had over 3,000 monks from different religions living as either hermits or in monasteries there. And no women were allowed on Mount Athos. It was as isolated as could be. And there was this fellow. He was an American. He had a heart condition. He was about 50 years old, and he didn't know if he was going to die or not. But he decided, instead of the medication, he went over to Mount Athos. He was taking his medication all the way up to the point that he got to Greece, and he finds a hermitage that he could stay in, which was essentially a cave in the side of the mountain. And brothers from one of the monasteries below would bring bread and water up every morning and leave it at the front of the cave. He stayed up there for 60 days, and he writes a book about his experience. And his pulse rate, dropped a lot. His blood pressure was just incredible, and at least for the next 10 years, when he returned home to the United States, he never had any blood pressure problems. And all he ate for the time he was out there was bread and water. But instead of feeling hungry, he felt more and more fulfilled each day. And you read about the different monks and hermits in particular in Egypt, the story of Siddhartha. There was a prince and he's looking for enlightenment. He had all this power and he could have seen so much. He could have called on all the men of great wisdom and women of great wisdom to tell him the answers to life. And he finds his best answer came from a guy who ran a boat across the river, just ferried people from one side to the other. And ultimately, that's what Gautama Siddhartha Buddha did for a long time himself toward the end of his life. The answers that he wanted were in the river. If he just listened. So I'm not going to say that the answers are in the river. They're in lots of places. But the clue to finding the answers are to stop talking. It's just the opposite of what I'll be doing today. To stop talking and to listen. The best prayer is always to listen, not to talk. So I'll leave it there for now.
Wow, no, that's you remind me of one of my when I was back home. I was in sixth grade. I was very confused and I had an exam coming up. And I'm one of those that I take it very seriously. I have to ace it, right? And I was crying. And he came and he said, what's the problem? And I said, I can't understand this. I don't know. My life is ending. And he said, open up Bhagavad Gita, open up any page, you'll find your answer. And that's exactly what I did. So when you just shared about your experience with that Bible,
Yeah,
I resonate. I
yeah,
resonate.
that is so cool.
Um, yeah. And it gives you the answer you need at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Wagner, since I am from India, and it sounds to me like your book could have been titled with Shri Vishnu or Brahma in mind. Could it be, or could it?
Yeah, it could, because from the first page to the last page, the answer is pretty much the same that one gets in both Hinduism and Buddhism, in the sense of you want to align yourself with God, you need to listen to God. And much of what we'll be talking about will be about listening to God. We're not going to give you answers, because you listen to our broadcast the next day or two. It's just like listening to anybody on TV talking about religion. There's a big difference between talking about God and putting you in a position where you might finally listen to him. Too often, we don't put ourselves in that position until we're desperate. We're dying. We got a big test coming up. Um, we're in desperate straits. We grab for a book in a hotel room that we've never been in before. We close our eyes and we say a prayer and we flip the book open and just put our finger down. I have no idea that's not an abracadabra. I was lucky that it worked that time. Just the right sentence came out. And I do think God had a hand in that. But more importantly, the hand pointed to the idea that what you need to do is listen to God. I mean, even think of the sentence, my peace I give to you, my peace I leave with you. The reason that's so affirming and so calming is because as you think about it, you recognize you haven't been abandoned. You recognize that you are in good hands if you'll only accept them. And so it's not so much having a litany of answers. Um, it's just recognizing, as Siddhartha did, or as you did, the answers are in the river. Listen to the river. Go into a church that has no one else in it. Listen.
Yeah, I can only imagine going through that experience, how it would feel, right? Um, could Jews and Muslims benefit from the book too? And if how?
Well, they all have ritual prayers that I think ritual prayers can sometimes help you get into that state of quiet. Just like saying the rosary, the Catholics aren't thinking about each of the words of the Hail Mary as they go through that. It just becomes a ritual that frees their mind because their mouth is moving, they got something to do, and they're doing it automatically. Jews will often, they call it davening, and that means as they're praying, they're going like this. Um, well, I forget whether it's Hindus or Buddhists also have a rosary sort of thing, beads that they,
Hindus, yes.
Hindus, yeah. And so those kind of things that help set you apart from the world around you is a way of opening up a door to the world you don't see around you, and that's beyond. So I think in the major religions, you had Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and they certainly meditate as well, and Jews and Christians all together. You pretty much cover most of the world. And the most scholarly sorts of writers in all those areas seem to have a sense that you can't talk your way into communion with God. You have to listen and hope that communion with God is what results.
So is that the purpose of chanting too, right? Then, because when you're chanting, you're focusing and I guess opening up that channel to listen.
Right. Well, if Jeanene were here, she would be saying she likes old time Christian music, and I don't get it, but I'm with her at times. When this is going on, but she said it takes her mind out of the things that are going on around her, and I can appreciate that not with that type of music, but I can appreciate it with Gregorian chant. Um, Gregorian chant used to be very restful to me. When I was an altar boy, all the masses were in Latin, and people would say, "Well, how do you appreciate um, any kind of religious experience when it's in a language that you don't understand most of the words of?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, it's because I don't understand most of the words that it brings me closer to God. When the mass changed to English, I'm listening to words that I hear all the time." And it's really easy for me, just like when you're in a class, to be listening to the professor, and your imagination is also thinking about what you're going to do that night when you get home. So when the language is the same, you can easily drift in and out of the conversation. But when the language is different, so for example, the Latin Mass, and you speak only English, um, you only hear Latin when the focus is on God. And so it's hard to let your imagination drift away. Now, the key is, because I know I'm talking to other people, if you go into Latin Mass and you're talking English and you never really get started focusing on God, then the whole time the Latin Mass is going on, you're daydreaming. But if you go in and you do try to focus on God from the beginning, once you get drawn into the Mass, it's hard to get to drift away, because every time you drift away, you're hearing this Latin and it brings you right back. I'm here to talk to God. And so I think that's the same sort of thing when people are davening, or when people are meditating in any sort of way. The periodic gong, which says, "Remember why you're here." The drum beat, just the one beat, and nothing else comes. Reminds you why you're here.
You just solved a mystery for me. because I recently in a conversation with a dear friend, I was telling him that my ecstasy is the Sanskrit chanting. I don't understand it, but when I hear it, I'm like, ooh, you just solved my mystery.
Yeah.
Thank you. So moving to the next question.
All right.
To be clear, however, the book is written in primarily for Christians, right? So
All right.
what does that mean? What is the primary Christian part?
Well, many of the examples will be focused on stories from what Christians call a New Testament. But that's really important. I mean, obviously, as Christians, we believe that. But what's really important is what it draws you into in terms of meditation. Every through every few pages throughout the book, there are a series of meditative points that you're invited to think about, and just set the book aside and focus on that meditative point. More of them will have a Christian episode in mind, but they won't all have a Christian episode in mind, but they'll have the same effect. One of the things that uh, an important point in the Judaic Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament,
Hmm.
and I'm sure in Buddhism and other, certainly in Islam, the story of uh, the recreation of the earth. So in the case of Noah, he gets upset with the people as the story goes, and so he floods things, and then afterwards he comes and says to Noah, he doesn't have a long talk with him. He just tells him, "What I created was good. Now you're stewards of the world. You must take care of it." His point is, God will never abandon us. But God's not a magician or an ATM machine either. You don't say a prayer and stick it into an ATM machine and suddenly your cancer is cured or you win the lottery. That's silly. That's childhood. The point is, he's not going to abandon you. You're stewards of this world. You're stewards of one another.
Hmm.
This world was good. Now it's up to you to continue that. I'll be by your side, but I'm not going to be, working miracles willy-nilly because he asked me. Any miracles that do happen, and I think they do from time to time, but I have no idea why. That's up to God. Uh, but we're stewards. We have the responsibility to take care of one another and take care of this world.
And then I guess it would depend on the person too, how they define miracle. Like for me, it's a miracle I woke up today. But no, that's and then the other thing I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, um when you ask for help, when you really ask, obviously God's not coming down himself, but he connects you, he puts you in an environment where there are people that help you. Like you just solved my mystery.
Maybe he does. I don't know. I just
Yeah.
don't know. Because one of the things that we also need to be cautious of, we can't turn God into an ATM machine. Like, oh, I wanted this to happen and God made it happen. And
Mhm.
I've done that myself when I've been looking for a parking space and I'm late to getting into a performance. Son of a gun, a parking space opened up right by the front door. And God, you're taking care of me. No, he's not. I'm really lucky that happened. Maybe he did make it happen, but I don't know that. And that would be trivializing God's role in the world if it degrades him to the ATM machine. I said a prayer and parking space opens up. And so I don't do that. What did God play a role? I don't know. Uh, the promise is he'll never abandon us.
Wow, that's super deep in a way. Okay, tell us little about each of your religious backgrounds. Like, for example, Dr. Wagner, you, have taught courses in philosophy of religion at the graduate level and at the undergraduate level. What do you talk about in such courses?
That's really a good question, because when I come across somebody who's never had any background in philosophy of religion, they immediately think that you're going to be talking about different religions. And we don't. We're philosophers, we're not sociologists. So we're not talking about, different cultures and so on. I just went to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, Texas this past weekend. And they have this huge exhibit in town for, I guess it's been in town for about a month, and it's leaving next week. And it's showing religion across all sorts of various cultures, which is really kind of interesting. First of all, the word was religion used as though it cuts across all cultures. Well, you find religious talk, or talk about God, talk about creation across many cultures, and long before we ever had national boundaries of any kind. So that sort of thing has gone on. But that doesn't mean that everything that matters about relationships between people and God can be reduced to social or cultural conveniences. We humans stumble around to somehow cement different social practices, and that would include social practices that bring us together to address God, and maybe even help us alone address God. But we should never we should never confuse those humanly restricted efforts as being the success of a genuine communion with something beyond the material world, as a God.
Wow.
Oh, what we do talk about in philosophy, I almost forgot that what we do talk about in philosophy of religion is essentially three things. Theism: is there any justification for claiming that there's a God in any religion? Next, deism: is there any grounds for, there was a philosopher by the name of Spinoza, who was raised as a Jew, was in a Christian environment, didn't fit into either one, but believed that there could be an intelligence behind in the world. And the great Albert Einstein, when asked about his religious preferences, he said he guessed that he was most likely to be considered in the tradition of Spinoza. In other words, deism, that there must be creation. You, how do you get material goods from a non-material universe? And so there had to be, some kind of creation. Um, but from what? If you have no material, no protons, no electrons, even energy of any kind, has got to be material. Entropy is about something. It's not about nothing. Um, then where does that all come from? So that would be deism. And so in philosophy of religion, we talk about the strength of arguments and criticisms that would apply to atheism, deism, or any theistic position. And I've been happy to say that every time I've taught the course, I've gotten students ranging from atheists to Muslims to evangelicals to anything you can imagine. And some would just call themselves spiritualists. And the result we get from the students is that the course surprised them. And I think the reason the course surprised them, they thought it was going to be some kind of social cultural thing about, here Presbyterians think this, and Hindus think this, and just turning it all into so much sociology. And we never did that. And as a consequence, each effort to confirm some aim of communion with a creator, or denounce any creator, was honored, because we were looking at the strength of arguments for those three main streams together, and beyond that, philosophy can't go.
This was a one semester course, like
It
all
was a one semester.
graduates.
Well, I taught it about a half a dozen times. It was a one semester course. Sometimes it would be for graduate students. Sometimes it was a different course for undergraduates. And the only difference between the two was the level of readings that I would have them take on.
Interesting. You mentioned great promise. What 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 does that mean? What do you have in mind when you talk about the great promise?
Well, let me start from a deistic position, and then I will go to Christianity on that one. I think the great promise is, like as God said to Noah, I created the world. Okay, so it didn't have to be Noah. He could have said that to Siddhartha. He could have said it to anybody. I created the world. Now you need to take care of it. Okay, so that would be a generalization of it all. But I think I could push it even a little bit further in terms of uh, the Christian worldview, and maybe the Judaic worldview and the Islamic. But certainly the Christian worldview is going to say this: when Christ dies on the cross, um, he says to God, my God, why hast thou abandoned me? Now, some people will jump on that and say, well, God did abandon him. He abandoned his own son. No, he didn't. Jesus was not talking to the people when he said that. Well, who was Jesus talking to? Well, he was talking to God, as Christians would say, God the Father. So they were still both in communion with each other, even when Jesus said, why hast thou abandoned me? And God hadn't abandoned him, or else that conversation couldn't have taken place. It wouldn't have been a conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the true message of Christianity, when they say, Jesus died for your sins, and he's brought you back into an opportunity to have more good times ahead after you leave this world. All that depends not on becoming trick dogs who prance around and do certain things to earn your way there, but it means that regardless of what you do, you'll never be left alone. Just like in that hotel room when I grabbed for that green Bible, and I've never looked at a Gideon Bible my whole life except that one day. He'll never abandon you. And that doesn't mean it's going to be abracadabra, and he fixes everything up. I used to push a book cart around MD Anderson Cancer Hospital, and I've seen almost every type of cancer you could imagine. I've seen a room full of people on their knees next to the bedside of somebody dying of cancer. And these people, they may love their uncle or their granddad or their father, their mother. They're praying their eyes out for that person's life. The person still dies. Did God abandon them? No. What they wanted was something different than God's continued communion with them. What they wanted was a payoff. They wanted God to somehow come in and resurrect the guy from the bed, the patient. What they wanted was for everything to be as they wanted. That's not the great promise. The great promise, even to his own son who's dying on a cross, says, I'll never abandon you. The great promise is that person dying, and I've seen people at MD Anderson dying of cancer. I even saw one die peacefully, and he was very devout. They never felt abandoned once they realized it's about not being abandoned. It's about, it's about not being abandoned. It's not about getting a goodie or an amusing trick of some kind. It's not about necessarily curing the cancer. Might a God cure someone's cancer? Well, of course he can. Um, but why God might do that isn't because you plug a prayer into the ATM machine. Why God might do that Heaven only knows. Our comfort should be no further than, and it's a great comfort, He'll never abandon us. What more could you ask for? That's why it's a great promise.
Wow. So, what about the great path? What do you mean by the great path?
On a great path, there's lots of stories throughout biblical history of somebody who uh, did wrong, somebody who did right. In the early uh, Judaic Bible, there's a story just following Adam and Eve. They have a couple of kids, Cain and Abel. And Cain gets upset at Abel and he kills him. And so they have God saying to the people at the time, don't do anything about this. I will take care of it. And what I think he means by that is that uh, people will do wrong and they will do right. God will, because he will never abandon us, he'll walk with us as even doing wrong and right, unless we decide to really make a right angle turn and walk off the path altogether. And I think the path, the great path, is very broad. I think devout Muslims, devout Christians, devout Jews, devout Buddhists, devout Hindus can all be on the path. The people that decide to eschew the path altogether, who take that right angle turn. It isn't just a matter of believing differently. It isn't just a matter of, I stole this 2 cents from something or whatever, or I yelled at somebody, or I punched somebody in the nose just because I didn't like them. That wasn't good, but you recognize that wasn't good. So you didn't really leave the path. You just screwed up. Cain presumably didn't leave the path, but he certainly screwed up in killing his own brother. That some people do leave the path. They make a right angle turn. They essentially give a finger to the whole idea of godness. They've left the great path to their own misfortune.
What if somebody is in that situation and then something happens after years later and then they return to the path? Is that possible?
Oh, sure. But, heck of a chance
Yeah.
because we tend to, there's the only Nobel Prize winning psychologist in history, Daniel Kahneman, and he talks about thinking biases. And one of those is the confirmation bias. That tells us a lot about us, and then it's relevant to the great path. As you walk along the great path and you see things that delight your heart and soul, it's more likely to keep you walking along the great path. If you make that right angle turn, and so in the great path, it gives us a lot of room. So to make the right angle turn, you got to walk for a while to get off that path altogether. After you've walked off that path, the likelihood of you not looking for confirming evidence that leaving the path was right is going to be slim, because by our very nature, we tend to confirm our biases. So if you had biases that led you off the path, it is highly unlikely that you'll see anything to bring you back. Instead, you'll tend to see more of what will take you away from the great path.
I guess that's why in early days we are taught mind your circle, mind your circle.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So I think we're going to my last question for this session. Um, you talked about prayer. What do you mean by that?
I think prayer is an effort and of good intent to commune with something greater than self. We have a tendency to want to manufacture God in a light that makes sense to us. And that's not, that I think is leading away from prayer. Just as we want God to accept us as we are, we need to accept God as God is. And I don't think God wears a baseball cap. I don't think, God is a certain height or a certain weight. I don't think God needs photons, electrons. He doesn't need any of the material of the world. At one point, there was a Catholic priest by the name of Lemaitre, and he was a physicist. And he took some of the data that Hubble, the great astronomer, had, and he concluded that there was a big bang beginning to the universe. And Lemaitre and Einstein became very good friends. And Einstein, too, thought that the idea of a big bang made sense. Even Hawking did initially. The problem is you go the other way and say, where did everything come from? And Hawking himself tried to reverse engineer the mathematics of cosmology, and you got back to a point of the singularity. And the singularity had all the information of creation, but it had no width, it had no height, it had no weight, but all the information of the entire universe, of all creation, was in that mathematical singularity. Now, Hawking had since walked away from that point shortly before he died, but it's still a fascinating point. And the idea that, man, it just seems there had to be something where the information led to material, and material had to follow rules. And not only did information have to follow rules, but it also has chance built into it, which I think is one of the great miracles of any God figure. Before the world was created, presumably when we design something, we don't build chance into it. We humans, we try to make sure we don't have chance into it typically. That here is what it is, here's a sandcastle. We don't want the sandcastle to fall over or whatever. We want it to be solid. If there was nothing, during a time of nothing, no things, no energies, no stuff, there could not have been chance, because there was nothing for which chance could have affected. So God must have intended to develop a world that was interesting. And one of the things that makes the world interesting is the novelty of chance. Mm-hmm. And so with all of our great sciences, and they're extraordinary, and I think they're one of the ways that God lures us into prayer. I think science and prayer go together nicely. Chance keeps the world interesting for us just as it does for him.
And I've heard one of the religious lectures, the lecturers mentioned that, I mean, even in biology, we learned that our brain, we're not using it 100%, right? And if we think that we understand God or the creator with the minimal that we're using our brain, can you imagine what happens when we actually use the entire brain, or all the functions that is capable of?
Well, yeah, you got to be careful with that we don't use a lot of our brain. The best that we have in neuroscience tells us we're using all the brain that we have all of our life.
Really?
Yeah. And in fact, from our earliest days, our brain cells are dying off. And throughout our lifetime, our brain cells are dying off. Interestingly enough as well, we keep on learning more, don't we? So we have
Mhm.
fewer and fewer brain cells because they're dying off, but we keep learning more. People who corrupt that process might be like a drug user or an alcoholic, and they suffer real damage to their brain. And so they tend not to learn more as they get older. Their brains continue to die at an accelerated rate without any new information seemingly being developed. There was a young girl over in England who was in some kind of gifted and talented program, and she got injured in some way. And I don't remember the whole story, but I remember this: when they did an fMRI scan on her to see what brain injury there might be. Now remember, she had already been placed in a gifted and talented program. As far as psychologists could tell, she was a really bright girl. But under the fMRI, half of her brain was missing.
Mhm.
Yeah. And one of the things that we find, we in the old days, we used to say like the left side of the brain was logic and language, and the right side of the brain was creative and blah, blah, blah. Well, one of the things that we've learned over time is that that's by chance that most brains pick up that kind of activity in one hemisphere as opposed to another, but they don't have to stick to just that. There's excess neural material and paths that can be utilized to accommodate injuries on the other side of the brain, or in the front of the brain and the back of the brain. We always talk in terms of it left and right just because we look at a model of the brain. What's in the front part of the brain has our executive decision making, the frontal lobe and the prefrontal lobe. Back of the brain has the stem, the brain stem, which is what keeps our heart beating and our lungs functioning well and all that. The pictorial image of the brain being in half like this is very misleading because the brain functions very differently from its front and its back as well. So where a brain injury might occur and what other brain functions might be able to take over and compensate for that is a great mystery, but it's not a mystery that it happens. We just don't know how it happens in specific cases, and even in general cases, we're just grinding our way through that now. Oh, here's one along those same lines. There was a he's actually a neurologist at the University of Pennsylvania years ago, back in the 1990s, before fMRIs. He had to use a PET scan, and he scanned people that were experts at praying. Well, what's an expert in praying? Well, he took nuns who were cloistered and living in a monastery and just, prayed all day except when they were eating and all that. He took Buddhist monks, literally from Nepal, who came over and, went through his little experiment. He took all sorts of different people who were serious about praying. And here's the way the experiment went. In a room, they had the PET scan set up. But before you go in, he would say, now I want you to go in and pray for about a half an hour. I'll speak to you over the microphone sort of thing. And at first, as soon as we hook you up to the scan, um, we'll take a scan right off the bat. Then after that, you pray, we'll continue scanning, and after a half an hour, come on out. And I'll ask you how your prayer went. So he would do that. So the baseline was you're on the table, or you wouldn't be on a table, but you're sitting there, and they scan your brain, and your brain is operating the way it would just normally operate. And then you pray. When you come out, he would ask you, the first question would be, was your prayer successful? Because prayer isn't always successful. You try to commune with God. Hello, anybody there? Hello. And he just doesn't seem to want to answer the door. And so if they came out and they said their prayer wasn't successful that day, interestingly enough, the scan during that time that they were in there praying looked just like the baseline. For those that came out and said, yeah, my prayer was successful, and this is across religions that are on opposite sides of the world, and they might come out and they'd say, yeah, my prayer was successful. There were neurological differences, and neurological differences of those people who had successful prayers look somewhat alike across the religions that the people we're a part of. Now, what does that mean? And Neuron says, I don't know what that means, but what it does tell me is that you get a certain pattern of brain flow. That's what PET scans do, is look for brain flow. You get certain scans of blood flow to parts of the brain that seems to be unique when people, regardless of their cultural background, are said to be successfully praying. And those seem to be different from moments when they don't seem to have any success at their prayers. What does all that mean? Neurath himself says, I can't tell you that that tells us anything about God. All I can tell you, because I'm a neuroscientist, all I can do is tell you that when people go through this, we see this neuroanatomical difference. And it is provocative.
I'm lost for words. I, as you're talking, I'm trying to fit stuff in my mind, but yeah, I don't have words. Dr. Wagner, I'm going to go back and re-listen to this and still understand. But next part, when we start talking about being a good person, being a bad person, and uh, everything else that goes with it, um, Mrs. Wagner would be with us. So
Yeah, she'll
I'm
tell you about
very
good person, and I'll stick to bad person.
okay. Okay. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to hearing her. Um, thank you so much once again for the knowledge, for the wisdom, for the time. Namaste, sir. Thank you.
Namaste.